So you used the word fascism, and I'm hearing increasingly that uh, Hitler. How's the phrase go? Hitler lost the war, but the fascists won.
Mm.
I'm hearing that more and more, and I think
Mhm.
it's becoming more relevant in the discussion, especially here in Canada right now.
Oh yeah.
Uh, so I just would like your thoughts on that. Are we seeing um, a conflict emerging globally between communism and fascism again?
I strongly believe that understanding what fascism is requires looking into economics. That there is a lot of people that think fascism is an aesthetic. Fascism is, ultra patriotism. Fascism is whenever someone wears a uniform. Fascism, that's not the essence of fascism. Fascism is when capitalism enters an economic crisis. You have divisions in society, you have people protesting and rioting, and there's instability. And fascism is one section of the rich and powerful take control of the government, and they use the government to forcibly depopulate and degrow, to drive down living standards, to stabilize capitalism. That's what fascism is. And they invent all kinds of ideologies to do it. Hitler, it was all about swords and Wagner and anti-Semitism and knights and castles and Sleeping Beauty and whatever. In Italy,
anti-communism.
Yes.
Anti-communism was a driving force for the German Nazis.
Absolutely. In Italy, they talked about futurism, and they had some like science fiction stuff going on, and they really didn't like women, and it was like, the future of speed and misogyny, and they come up with all kinds of different things to justify what it is. But the essence of fascism is economic. It is about driving down living standards, driving down the population in an attempt to stabilize capitalism. And a lot of the aesthetics of Nazism, and this is important to point out, a lot of them were actually stolen from communism. For example, right? Everyone knows Hitler had this, this particular mustache. Well, why was that? That was because back in the 1920s and 30s, they didn't have intricate printing technology. So if they're making a poster with the leader of your movement on it, he had to have a particular mustache. So everyone knew when they saw that mustache, that's Hitler.
Well, I thought he stole it from Charlie Chaplin.
Right. Well, the communists had already done that, right? Lenin was bald and he had a goatee. Stalin had a handlebar, and it was just kind of understood. If you're building a popular movement with a leader in that time period, you wanted him to have a very distinct mustache, so everyone knew who he was. That was what that was, right? Before the Nazis had their salute, communists had their salute, which was the fist, right? That comes out of the Paris Commune. It was a communist uprising in France, and they started, saluting like this. The Nazis, they wore red armbands with the swastika on them. Well, before the Nazis were doing that, the communists in Germany, they wore red armbands with a hammer and sickle on them. And that a lot of the things the Nazis did is they saw, well, the communists are effectively organizing. They're building their labor unions and their activist groups. And we're going to copy some of their techniques because they work, because it's just good for building a mass movement. And what's weird is that now the memo has been sent out. Anyone who wears a uniform, anyone who has a salute, anyone who, has a leader that they really promote, well, they're a fascist. Well, no, actually, fascism just kind of stole the aesthetics from communism, and communism just kind of invented those aesthetics because they were effective in building a mass movement. Meanwhile, a lot of the actual beliefs of the Nazis, like their beliefs, not their practices, not the costumes but their actual beliefs have actually been adopted by the left. For example, environmentalism, right? The Nazis were huge environmentalists, right? We are going to save our sacred mountains and forests, and we're going to reduce the population and save our mountains and forests. Occultism, right? And this is very interesting to me. In Europe, in the time the Nazis were around, it was the communists were atheists. They believed in science and atheism. The normal, centrist view was Christianity. You were Catholic or Protestant or whatever. That was the normal view. But then it was the far right and the fact.
Oh, we lost your mic.
I think you're unplugged.
I'm back.
You're back.
I'm back. Yeah, and it was the far right. They were the ones that were really into occult rituals and paganism and mysticism and talking to spirits and they worshipped Odin and Valhalla and the pre-Christian gods of Europe. That was all right wing. But now a lot of that pagan stuff is actually considered to be left wing, which is very interesting. a big aspect of Nazism and fascists everywhere is they want to go backward. They want to go back, right? They feel like we've gone too far. We need to go backward. And that's always been a central, Julius Evola, who was one of the main thinkers of Italian fascism. He wrote Revolt Against the Modern World. And he argued that there's like this sacred way. There's this natural way that human beings should live, and we've gotten away from it. We need to get back and restore the natural order or the organic state. That's all fascist ideology, but that's what the left now believes, right? They want to bring us back into balance with Mother Nature. They want to reduce the population. They want to protect the trees and forests from human beings that are a cancer on, a lot of the actual beliefs of the Nazis are now adopted by the left. And then they look at other people. And I mean, I'm called a fascist all the time. I've been on the left my whole life. I was arrested in police brutality protests. I was video recording acts of police brutality and going to protests with police brutality protesters long before it was cool. I was one of the organizers and planners of Occupy Wall Street. I'm routinely called a fascist just because I support Russia and China and just because I don't go along with the whole woke thing. But, you can call me a fascist because you don't like Putin or whatever. But it's like, if you look at the left, like the woke left, and their desire to degrow and go back to nature, their fascination with primitivism and mysticism and the occult, their desire for like a very authoritarian state that will like forcibly degrow everything. That sounds a lot more like what the Nazis actually believed. Maybe not how they dressed, maybe not how they spoke, but what they actually believed. That's actually very much in line with what the so-called left now believes. So,
and a true fact, this is a true fact, that the Satanic Temple stands with Ukraine.
Wow.
They're constantly putting out statements, about their outreach and activism in Ukraine. They stand with the Nazis in Ukraine. And yeah, a lot of the kind of darker occult groups in America, which tend to be left-wing, totally standing with Ukraine. And it's interesting to note that more of the right-wing Christian conservatives in this country support Russia in this conflict.
Well, I mean, I was listening to the Russians at the UN last week. They were talking about how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is being persecuted, and they've tried to label the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as a Russian government front group. They've seized its property. They're persecuting priests and others in the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So, yeah, I can see that, and that these are kind of things where we live in a period. I think Weird Al Yankovic. He had a song. He said, "Everything you know is wrong."
Yeah,
I think we're entering a period like that because nothing makes any sense anymore at this point. Yes. Everything you know is wrong, right? The communists are more Christian than the capitalists are. The communists believe in growth and entrepreneurialism more than the Western capitalist countries do. Right. I mean, you get into the details of it. I mean, the left loves the FBI. That's my favorite, right? The
FBI.
The
CIA, boy, they love CIA.
Yeah.
They love war.
Yeah.
I love Satan. I mean, I'm not joking.
No, you're not. Like,
I'm not kidding.
Everything we thought we knew is completely wrong. I would argue the Cold War normal in American politics, right? That was the Cold War normal. It was after the upsurge of the 60s when you had Nixon came in and the rise of the neoconservative thinkers. There was what I called the Cold War normal. And that was where, you had the Republican Party and conservatives that were ultra patriotic and religious, and they were like the core. And then you had the Democrats and the liberals that kind of believed the same thing, but they were like critical. They thought more critically. They were more friendly to Europe, stuff like that. That was how American politics was from about the 1970 up until like the fall of the Bush administration. But once Bush was out, all of a sudden politics in America has been spiraling in a very weird direction. Right. And the right wing doesn't know what they believe in, and the left wing doesn't know what they believe in. And there's a lot of confusion because we're in a crisis as a society. Economically, living standards are dropping. People don't know what to believe in anymore. And so everything has kind of been reshuffled. The neoconservatives, they ran right wing politics in America for a long time. And in the Bush years, they created a lot of problems. I think the main thing that they did is when Bush invaded Iraq, he drove the oil prices through the roof. And that was really good for ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron. But it was also very good for Russia because Russia rebuilt their economy by selling oil and gas. And so suddenly Russia was making a lot of money selling oil, and Putin was able to rebuild their economy. was also very good for Hugo Chavez, the leader of Venezuela, right? Because Venezuela's oil, and he used that oil to build a state-run economy in Venezuela, and that Bush drove the oil prices up, and that kind of, let the opposition to the United States around the world surge forward. The other thing was that the United States has used Muslim fanatics as their foot soldiers and their allies in the Middle East for years. The Muslim Brotherhood, they worked with the CIA in Egypt, and they worked against Abdel Nasser, who was like a socialist leader in Egypt. And in Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood has carried out terrorist attacks against the Ba'ath socialist government there.
And the whole war in Afghanistan against the Soviets back in the 70s and 80s.
Absolutely. And
they created Osama bin Laden to defeat the Soviet Union, right?
Absolutely. And the United States has had these relationships with Wahhabi and Islamic terrorists and extremists. But after 9/11 in the United States, you had this kind of surge of Islamophobia. And Bush, at one point, he slipped and he referred to the war on terror as a crusade. And that didn't go over too well in the Muslim world. They didn't like hearing that. And that a lot of these pastors and evangelical ministers that were neoconservative and were in the Bush camp, they were just playing up the idea that Islam is evil. And these videos were going overseas, and people were seeing that in the Muslim world. And people that were useful allies of the United States in Saudi Arabia or in the Muslim Brotherhood, all of a sudden they were seeing that and they were getting angry about it. So the neocons kind of screwed up everything. And they created a lot of problems. And then when the U.S. economy ultimately crashed in 2008, all of a sudden everything got renegotiated. And I would argue they've been picking up the pieces ever since. I argue Barack Obama was a 21st century Napoleon. You want to hear about this?
Yes.
Because when
I'm intrigued now.
When Napoleon, he was a general in the French army before he became like the dictator of France, right? And he tried to conquer Egypt and he tried to conquer Syria. And the British at that point were the colonizer of Syria and Egypt. And Napoleon wanted to take it over for France. And Napoleon, he'd been a Freemason and they'd studied the Quran and Masonry. So Napoleon sent his soldiers all over Syria and Egypt to put up posters where Napoleon claimed he was a Muslim. And he said, I'm a Muslim. I'm a follower of the prophet. I've come to restore your rights. Yeah. And it worked to some degree. A lot of the local Egyptians and Syrians said, oh, well, maybe this Napoleon guy's good. He'll fight the British who have been oppressing us for a while. And he wasn't a Muslim. Napoleon was lying through his teeth, but he was educated. He knew about Islam. And he thought, oh, I'll fake out the Muslim world, get them on my side by kind of pretending to be a Muslim. That's what Barack Obama's presidency was.
No, I never put that together before, Caleb. That's very true.
He never said he was a Muslim, but his middle name was Hussein, right? And he had this like made for TV Twitter war with Netanyahu. And there was this whole feeling he was going to reboot America's relations with the Muslim world. He was going to show the Muslim world that America didn't hate them anymore. But it was all fake. The USA kept giving loads of money to Israel. The USA toppled the government of Libya. The USA manipulated the Arab Spring to spread chaos. But it was very effective. Could you imagine what would have happened if Bush had been president during the Arab Spring, right? If that Arab Spring uprising had happened and the commander-in-chief of the United States was a guy in a cowboy hat who's like, I'm going to fight Al-Qaeda, these terrorists, these Muslims, we're going to kill them all in a crusade. If that had happened, there would be like 5 more Irans right now, right? Because we had Barack Hussein Obama, who, he's not a Muslim, but his middle name's Hussein, wink, 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 and he met with Edward Said, wink, 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 and he went to a Muslim school in Indonesia when he was a kid, wink, wink, wink. That was very key in the USA manipulating the events of the Arab Spring to get what they wanted, right? And so I see Barack Obama as a 21st century Napoleon, and that was an attempt to kind of, fix what Bush had screwed up with all these Muslim proxies. But it still points to the problem, which is, Al-Qaeda, they have no problem killing Americans. And look at, what came out of Obama, he was able to utilize these Muslim forces in Syria. What came out of that? ISIS, you know what I mean? And it's like, if you start, feeding a wild dog and sicking a wild dog on your enemies, there's a very good chance it'll just turn around and bite you. And that's what happened. The USA, we've had this policy of utilizing radical Islamic extremists, and using them to attack our enemies in Afghanistan or against the Russians, in Chechnya, the USA has backed radical Muslim extremists in Chechnya, or in Serbia, the USA backed the Kosovo Liberation Army that was like tied in with Al-Qaeda and all of that. And all over the world, the USA arms these radical Muslim extremists, and then stuff like 9/11 or the ISIS terrorist attacks happens, and we go, oh, wow. Well, the reason that this happens is because the American government is not really concerned about keeping keeping us safe. It's concerned about overthrowing anti-imperialist and socialist governments around the world. And like the Manchester bomber, right? Remember the Manchester bombing? That guy, he had been in Libya getting armed by the American and British government to fight Gaddafi, right? And he was an Islamic extremist, and his father was an Islamic extremist. And they'd lived in Britain for a while, and they were radical Muslims in Britain. And then they were from Libya. And then when the Libyan revolution was happening, they went back to Libya and they bombed and terrorized and cut people's heads off to overthrow Gaddafi. And then after the revolution was over, they got back on a plane and they went back to Britain. And then they did the same thing. And he didn't like that concert with the woman. He thought she was too scantily clad or whatever. So then he went and bombed a concert and killed all kinds of innocent people. Well, that's what happens when you give money to radical extremists who kill lots of innocent people. They're crazy. They're unstable elements, and they might turn around and attack you.
Just like the moderate rebels that we're funding over in Ukraine, those cute little Nazis that we seem to like so much.
Yeah, or
how's that going to work out for us in the long run?
Yeah, or the Chechens, the Tsarnaev brothers. The Tsarnaev brothers who bombed the Boston Marathon. You remember that?
Yeah.
Who were they? Their parents were Chechen separatists that the USA had armed to back and fight against the Soviet Union. And from what I understand, the Russian intelligence actually went to the American government and they said, these Tsarnaev brothers, these are dangerous guys. We've been tracking them on the internet and stuff. These are dangerous guys. Keep your eye on them. The U.S. government didn't listen to it. And look what they did. They bombed the Boston Marathon and they killed all these people. Right. And that was kind of what was going on behind the scenes. You remember Trump's Muslim ban? Do you remember that?
Yes. And everybody wigged out because he wanted to restrict travel in from certain countries.
Well, what that was about was that the CIA rewards people with visas. If you do the dirty work of the American intelligence agencies, if you do what the CIA and the FBI and the American intelligence and Pentagon want you to do in Syria or Iran or Iraq or wherever.
Afghanistan, look how many we brought in from Afghanistan after we left.
Yeah, it's a bribe. We'll give you a visa. Your wife and kids will get to go move to Brooklyn, New York or Texas or wherever. And it's a bribe. And so many of these terrorist attacks have been carried out not by the people who got the visa, but by their kids. They come here and they have kids, and they have very conservative, fanatical beliefs, but they're raising their kids in one of the most liberal societies where there's naked women on billboards and everyone's smoking pot and all of that. And so their kids have this like identity crisis. Plus, their parents have been involved in a really ugly war in Chechnya or Afghanistan or Syria, and their parents have, cut people's heads off and blew things up. And so their parents have like extreme PTSD, right? So they're growing up in a household with parents who have PTSD. Their parents are very fanatically religious, and they're raising their kids to be that way in a society that's very liberal and open and all of this. So their kids are in this weird place. Their parents probably, get abusive as a result of their PTSD. And if you look at all of these cases, the Tsarnaev brothers, Ahmed Rahami, the New Jersey bomber, the Pulse nightclub shooter, remember him? His father was an Afghan guy who had fought against the Soviet Union. That's what they are. They're the second generation. When we bring in these radical extremists, we reward them with visas. They give them a chance at the American dream after doing the American dirty work. Then they have their kids, and their kids have, live a screwed up existence because of the result of who their parents are and the values they're getting at home, plus the society they live in and the PTSD and all of that. That's who these shooters tend to be. And it appears to me that somebody in the FBI or in the Department of Homeland Security who was a Trumper said to Donald Trump, let's just stop this. Let's stop rewarding, these people with visas. Let's just stop doing that. Let's stop this soft power program for American intelligence of giving visas to people who do our dirty work. There's too much blowback. The Pulse nightclub, the Boston bombing. Let's just not do that anymore. And in response to that, who went nuts? It was clearly the intelligence agencies that went nuts, right?
That's right.
I remember when that was going on, you cannot protest in an airport, right? Lori, Rick, if all three of us got together and we said, we're going to go to an airport in America and have a protest, we would have the handcuffs put on us immediately and be dragged to jail within 2 seconds. We'd be dragged to jail. You can't protest in an airport. You can't even film in an airport. If you're filming in an airport with your phone, the police will come up to you and say, stop that. It's technically illegal to film in an airport. You might get arrested. But we're to believe that on like short notice, within like a couple hours of Trump's Muslim ban, thousands and thousands of people all over the country piled into the airports to protest, and all the TV cameras were all there to film them. And it was just an upsurge from below. It's just the people rejecting Trump's Muslim ban. Give me a break, you know? And they said it. I mean, if you watch the people that were opposing the Muslim ban, a lot of them said, look, these people around the world are serving the United States in Iraq. They're serving the United States in Syria. And we can't bring them to America. Boom. That's exactly what was going on there. It was about the intelligence agencies rewarding people with visas. There are disagreements within the deep state. And this, again, points to the fact that the left has become the spokesperson of the intelligence agencies. They are the foot soldiers of the CIA and the American intelligence agencies. And there is a lower level. There's people like Tulsi Gabbard. There's people like Michael Flynn. There's other people within the American deep state who aren't on board with this whole globalist agenda. And they have different goals. And they said to Trump, you know, stop giving visas to these extremists around the world. Trump listened to them, but then Trump was forced to rescind, right? There was enough of an upsurge by the intelligence apparatus and the well-connected, you know, powerful financial forces that Trump was forced to rescind. And unfortunately, you know, I know many Muslims. I'm not a Muslim myself. I'm a Christian, but, you know, I respect Islam. And, you know, I know most Muslims are not terrorists. The overwhelming majority reject terrorism. And I don't embrace a lot of the Islamophobia and just hatred for Islam we hear among conservatives. But I think that Muslim ban was not really about hating Muslims. It was about a difference in tactics among the intelligence apparatus.